So if there's any problems, just message me. Okay, so I'm recording on my end, recording on the computer. Bueno. Okay, so today we are being joined, and the conversation topic should really say Indigenous resistance and community-engaged learning. What are some pitfalls, shortcomings, and forms of solidarity that come about by understanding what Indigenous resistance is and Indigenous organizing is? So we are joined today by Comrade Clayton Thomas-Muller. He's a member of the, and he goes by he, him, all right, member of the Treaty Number 6 based Matias Colom Cree Nation, also known as the Puktawagan, located in northern Manitoba, Canada. Based currently in Winnipeg, he has been recognized by Yes Magazine as a climate hero and is featured one of 10 international human rights defenders in the National Canadian Museum for Human Rights. He has campaigned across Canada, Alaska, and the lower 48 states, organizing in hundreds of First Nations, Alaska Native and Native American communities support Indigenous peoples to defend their territories against encroachment of the fossil fuel industry, with a special focus on stopping the expansion of the Canadian tar sands and associated pipelines. Clayton is award-winning film director, media producer, organizer, facilitator, public speaker, best-selling author on Indigenous rights and environmental and economic justice. His book, Life in the City of Dirty Water, was a national bestseller and a CBC Canada Reads finalist. All right. I met Clayton 17 years ago or 16 years, 2005 or 2006. I met you at Trent University. We were both guest speakers at the Why Green Isn't Enough conference, looking at environmental racism. I remember hearing about you beforehand, but that was the first time that we met. We also met at several years later in upstate New York at the Rosa Luxemburg. They had that gathering of a bunch of different people, a bunch of characters, and you and I had to be able to touch base. And we met Toronto, New York, who knows how many other places in between. It is an honor. It is a tremendous honor for us to have Clayton here today. Clayton's seriously one of the titans of the environmental movements across the Americas. And you've contributed to so many different spaces. Thanks for being us, and thanks for sharing your time with us. Give it up.
All right. Yeah, before I get into it, I just want to say how much I respect your instructor. Chris is has had a level of consistency over the decades in terms of his commitment, to social movements, and is somebody that I have watched with great admiration and with great intention as a teacher. Somebody that when he speaks, I really pause and really try to be present. To hear what he has to say on whatever the topic of the day is, and certainly somebody that I strive to at least match in terms of just day to day, fighting for justice. And he's a really good brother. So thank you for inviting me to speak to your class today, Chris. And greetings to everybody there. Tanse, Busho, Zongi Benisi and Enetish Nakas, Genuto them, Winnipeg and Dojana, Pagadawagan Cree Nation and Doja. Before I get going here, I'm gonna I'm gonna sing a song to open us up and bring spirit into whatever space you're tuning into the meeting from, whether it be there at school or remotely, like I'm plugging in through Zoom. But while I sing this song, maybe, close your eyes if you like, and, just think about, focus on the idea of us putting our hearts and our minds and our spirits and our bodies together into this idea of creating a better future for future generations, to quote the great Sioux chief, Sitting Bull. Oh, get your big Parmesan, bawa binana ke. Make a naka wichi go to Anishinaabe. Yahweh, 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 oh, kitty big Parmesan, bawabilan manake. Make it naka wiki wo chawama Anishinaabe. Yahweh, 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 oh, Yahweh, 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 oh. Ho, 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 ho. All right. It's a turtle song. The turtle represents the teaching of truth. Those turtles, they're philosophers. They're always staring up at the universe, at the stars, and yeah, they represent that teaching of truth. And truth is such an important thing during this age of misinformation, artificial intelligence, the internet, and just with all of the crazy stuff happening in the world right now. To quote Malcolm X, the news has us, hating the oppressed and cheering on the oppressors in conflicts the world over. So Chris asked me to come and talk to y'all today about this idea of community engagement learning as a system, and how it could reinforce colonialism. And I think more importantly, I guess, what are the steps to dismantling colonialism? And so, obviously there's a lot to be said about that. I'm in no means expert on how universities and academia have used this model over the years, but in my Google search for the definition of what it means, I guess I would just open up with saying that there is a really big challenge that indigenous peoples, and I would argue other oppressed populations within settler colonial states such as Canada and the United States and others. Um, Go ahead.
No, it's okay, brother. Don't worry, keep
Oh,
going.
sorry.
No problem.
Where people, these institutions, one, are greatly funded by corporations, many of which are responsible for the existential threat of climate change, many of which are profiting, off of war and off of the neo-colonialism of indigenous lands and waters here in these lands that they call Canada, through our extractivism-based economy, our capitalist extractive economy, our predatory capitalist extractive economy. And furthermore, there is an effort by these corporate players to sponsor indigenous education, artistic, and cultural institutions, to try and win out our brightest young people, those that are achieving to better themselves, to empower their nations, through education. And part of that insidious model of sponsorship and the way that academia is designed is that when students who are working to acquire knowledge, degrees, to become professional in whether it's the sciences, geology, engineering, thermal power plant engineering, or oil and gas technologies, or geological technologies. Um, I mean, you name it, forestry, biology. um, the places where students tend to get placed are usually with these corporate players who are, double or triple dipping, so to speak, in terms of having first bat at influencing the trajectory of the lives of these students when they enter into Canada's workforce. And this sets up a really challenging dynamic in terms of the competitiveness around providing meaningful employment when these people start families or and enter the workforce. um, and and it's a very disproportionate competitive playing field for Indigenous nations, and certainly for social movements who are fighting for Indigenous rights, who are fighting for the implementation of, things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 recommendations, and fighting for climate justice, to try and compete with that kind of influence, that kind of structural racism, to provide opportunities for our folks, to work in an economy that doesn't prey, or that isn't predatorial on oppressed populations, that isn't a part of that system that many of us are fighting so hard to change. And I'm going to give you a case study at the end of my kind of 60,000 foot share, about an initiative called the Environmental Justice Climate Change the Environmental Justice Climate Change Organizing Initiative that took place in the early 2000s. And this also was a community learning engagement program. However, it wasn't run by academia. It was run by environmental justice networks, people of color, and Indigenous organizations across the lower 48 US, across Canada and Alaska, where 100 youth of color were trained up and placed in environmental justice networks to do community organizing around the issue of climate mitigation and adaptation and climate justice. But first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about myself. As Chris mentioned, I've been involved in social movements my entire adult life. I've been an elite global campaigner for a variety of environmental justice, Indigenous rights, and mainstream environmental groups over the last 20 years. And, through that experience, um, you know, um, well, let's just say I just got out of my seventh career burnout, and I've been burning the candle at both ends. And now that I'm at the age of 46, um, I have taken a big step back from organizing and running campaigns, to becoming pretty much a full-time writer, and engaging in public talks, presentations, like very much like this one, and really just traveling around and having conversations with communities about the 60,000 foot question: what is it actually going to take for us to move through and collectively heal from the violence of colonialism? And, I've traveled in the last year to probably about 25 cities, towns, communities, and plan on traveling to many more, to have that conversation. Um, and one of the things, in this moment of life that I've arrived in, that I have become very obsessed with, is this idea that colonization caused climate change. Um, it's only been 200 years of predatory capitalism that human beings have literally changed the chemistry of the planet, and our very existence and capabilities of living within the biospheres of where Creator placed us, is under threat. There is a 99% global consensus by the world scientific community that we have entered the era of the Anthropocene, of human impacted ecosystems at a planetary scale, and that we've only got about 6 years left to turn the tap off on fossil fuels, on the burning of fossil fuels and our fossil fuel centered truck and transport and bunker oil ship economy, our fossil fuel centered agricultural industrial complex, and certainly our fossil fuel driven, insane, maddening military industrial complex, which is probably the worst polluter when we're talking about climate change and our rapidly destabilizing climate. And so, when I think about this idea that colonization caused climate change, and what does that mean here in Canada? Well, for me, something that is very plain in plain sight is that whatever happens in terms of the implementation, the work, institutions, academia and unions and government, First Nations, Métis settlements, Inuit hamlets, municipalities, provincial and territorial governments, all the work on implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 recommendations. This work is inextricably linked to the policies that are developed and implemented and any action that is taken on climate change. You know, and the reason I say this is that, historically, let's take the idea of reparations. That word reparations is a very politically charged word, especially in the lower 48 USA. Historically, it is a word, used by Black social movements, for what's owed in terms of the slave trade. But I would say that, I've been a part of a lot of conversations with organizers from, Black social movements, from Indigenous social movements, from Latina social movements, Asian Pacific, social movements, many different groups about this idea of climate reparations, and the fact that those that contributed least to the global climate crisis are being impacted the worst, not only by our rapidly destabilizing climate, but also by the ongoing impacts externalized onto our communities by the fossil fuel industry and their extractive operations in or adjacent to our homelands. And this is particularly acute in places like the Alberta tar sands, the largest construction project in the history of human beings. And so, for me, one of the things that I'm very, very committed to moving forward is pushing the discourse, and having real conversations about topics like the colonial nature, how hardwired systems are, like academia, to, actually exacerbate colonialism and exacerbate, existential threats that we collectively face but are disproportionately affected by, like climate change and, conflicts attached to our rapidly destabilizing climate, such as never-ending climate-related war. This is essentially U.S. foreign policy. And so, these are really high-level, complex, thoughts. But we are certainly faced with a big undertaking, a huge responsibility, especially, our young people. I really feel for the youth of today, but I'm also equally as inspired and filled with hope by the young people of today. and a very complex intersectional analysis that young people are bringing to the table, not just in terms of being architects of the world's largest social movement ever built in the history of our species, but in all elements of our economy, colonization caused climate change, and therefore, our economic system requires a complete teardown and provides, that process provides us with an incredible opportunity to rebuild our economic structure in Canada and to do it in a way that we implement, the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that we get right the relationship between the settler colonial state of Canada and the original peoples of these lands that they call Canada now. That gives us the opportunity to build a new economic framework that is established with a strong foundation of justice that lifts up those workers in our economy whose lives are being disproportionately affected by the transition off of fossil fuels. That gives us an opportunity to put front of the line, undocumented workers and, people in the labor force who have been historically marginalized under the idea of unskilled labor. These terms they use to marginalize predominantly migrant workers and workers of color. If these social movements engage in social movement spaces with indigenous social movements, the original caretakers of the earth, and we unite, in this new reorganizing of our economic system, we have the potential to do things in a way that is not predatory, that doesn't sacrifice communities or create national sacrifice zones to line the pockets of corporate shareholders and corporate CEOs and the corporate elite. We have the opportunity to do things in a way, the way that I often talk about it is like, we're presented with two pathways, a fork in the road. One is kind of Donald Trump, Mad Max, psychopath, like crazy shit. And the other one's like straight up Star Trek, That's where we're at. And I think that the role of indigenous peoples within all of that, and in particular, in getting the economics of the Anthropocene, right, indigenous peoples carry a deep and millennia old historical understanding of the biosphere of which we live in. We understand, because of colonization, what it's like organizing social movements and building power with the end of the world juxtaposed against your efforts and the weight of that sitting on your shoulders, because in many ways we've already gone through the end of our world. And so a lot of what we have to offer is straight up know-how on how to build that world that science fiction writers are always describing. There's a very famous black science fiction writer. I forget her name. Adrienne Marie Brown's always quoting her, gosh, I can't remember her name, but she says that
Octavia Butler.
Octavia Butler, yeah, she says that organizers are the greatest science fiction thinkers of all, because we're consistently tasked with dreaming about another world being possible. And today that couldn't be more truer than ever. And so when indigenous peoples, we've been very, very patient and very kind and forgiving, in the face of predatory capitalism and in the face of settler colonialism and toxic patriarchy and violence that it brings into our world. We've been very protective of our worldview and cosmology, but also willing to share that with our brothers and sisters that we share the biosphere with, to help us to deal with the existential threat of climate change and never-ending war. And I think that, that's where I get most inspired by the young people, is that young people today, when they hit the streets and protest, when they hit the streets and say that they are land defenders, that they are water protectors, you know, when they stand together in solidarity around concepts such as Black Lives Matter, while carrying a sign telling Trudeau to stand, stop, the pipelines, to support tiny house warriors or the Wet'suwet'en. This kind of stuff is really like inspiring to me, as an aging organizer, as an aging campaigner. There's a level of sophistication there that I have not seen in my time on the front lines of organizing and building power in communities. And it's something that gives me great hope, especially as a father with two teenage sons who are growing up with an uncertain future. And so, a lot of work that's being done right now out there. Unfortunately, there's this crazy thing, and I think it's accentuated by the internet and um, and it'll certainly be accentuated by artificial intelligence and technologies like Chat GPT. But there is an amnesia that exists in social movements. A lot of people believe that social movements, that history is like this linear thing, when in reality, time, and trends and our experience in time, it's a cyclical thing. It's like a spiral, flying through space, circling around the sun. It's our reality, right? And a true revolutionary is somebody who discovers a negative and destructive, dominating cycle within that spiral of time and determines to replace it, to stop it, and to replace it with something that is regenerative, that is rooted in the sacred feminine creative principle. And, that work is happening around us every single day by revolutionaries across Mother Earth and certainly across these lands that they call Canada. Um, and, there is a lot of work that has already been done through social movements across the world, and certainly, in social movements like the American Indian movement, like the Black Panthers, Red Power here in Canada, like the Civil Rights Movement, where we have the tools, we have the knowledge, we have the know-how on how to change systems, oppressive systems, to dismantle them, systems like colonization, systems like white supremacy and patriarchy, bigotry throughout our communities. We know how to dismantle this stuff, and there are guiding frameworks that we can use, intersectional frameworks, not as law, not as rigid, law to govern our organizing efforts. No, but as frameworks, as guiding principles. And those are traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples, understanding where you live and what language the local peoples speak in your territory, and giving thanks to Indigenous peoples. Like in Toronto, I guess it's the Chippewas of the Thames. Understanding that gives you great power and legitimacy to fight and defend and to be a water protector in Toronto. Understanding that and acknowledging that when you speak, doing a land acknowledgement of where you're speaking from and what your priorities and what you care about, where you're raising your family, what a local economy you're giving back to and reciprocating towards. There are shared frameworks like the Hermes Principles of Democratic Organizing and the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice and the 21 Principles of Working Together. These are all things that you can Google and download and utilize when you're getting together with community to talk about the change that you want to bring about. Um, and, there are three stages of building movement alignment that exist. when you're organizing and building power in your community. When you get together with your kinship circles, the community that you share your life with, it's important to explore what your commonalities are. And, secondarily, it's important that you are consistently investing in the cultivation of mutuality. And then number three, it is really critical that you are consistently acting in solidarity. Solidarity is one of the greatest keystones of social movement organizing and building resistance to oppressive systems that have been dominating our lives and commodifying the sacred and commodifying our very bodies. And I would say that when we talk about community relational organizing, one of the programs that I was a part of way back in the early 2000s that was really freaking cool was this initiative that had about 50 environmental justice organizations involved called the Environmental Justice Climate Change Organizing Initiative. And, we organized this national conference and brought together 100 kick-ass youth of color, indigenous youth, and we brought all the elders of the environmental justice movement from Black, Latino, Latina, Asian, and Pacific Islander and indigenous communities together. And we did a training on the history of the environmental justice movement. And we brought definitions like what is climate justice, the right of all people to work, live, play, and pray in a safe and healthy environment. And we outed, environmental racism and the utilization of economic development as a terminology to try and impose the most toxic industries and industrial practices in our economy near or adjacent to disenfranchised, oppressed communities of color and indigenous nations. And these young people were sent out into the workforce to be placed for months at a time in the very organizations that came together to form this community relations program. And, these young people got to do all kinds of shit. They got to make banners for protests. They got to go and facilitate community, meetings to develop interventions in different EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, environmental justice consultations over harmful developments encroaching into communities that were already dealing with the toxic soup of refineries and petrochemical industries. These people got to be placed in indigenous governments to work with indigenous nations who are resisting settler colonial states' attempts to extract raw resources from their territories, to poison their waters, to understand climate science and the disproportionate impact that posed, that climate change posed to land-based cultures. It was a really, really cool initiative that, ended up in an almost 98% retention rate in terms of, like 98 out of these 100 kids are still kicking ass and have become movement leaders in the movement today. They're still organizing on climate justice. They're still organizing for environmental and economic justice. And I bring this case study up because, I think that community relations education can be a good thing when it's not tied to systemically racist infrastructure, such as the infrastructure that exists in the current status of academic institutions, especially in G8 economies like here in Canada, where you have big oil and big agriculture and big pharma, and the military playing such a huge role in influencing students and the trajectories of their career. I think that there needs to be consideration to civil society and the role that civil society and indigenous institutions and social movement institutions play in this field, this model of education that could be very beneficial in terms of this idea of building the largest social movement in the history of humankind and building the technical leadership required for the teardown of an unsustainable predatory capitalist economic system and the rebuilding of a system that is regenerative, that is restorative, and that is justice based into the future. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I want to have opportunity for y'all if you have questions for me, or if you have a reaction. Now's your time.
Yo, I got a couple to start off. You guys okay with that? Well, I'm your professor. You can say no. Okay, so no. No, you guys can do a sit-in. Okay, we'll teach you how to do a sit-in. But the key thing, if you do a sit-in, you gotta have a bathroom. Okay, that's important. Key thing. But anyways, that's a different time. That's another story. There's a couple really important things I want to take from both your talk as well as the book. All right, from everybody here. Just a reminder, anybody who's online who's got a question, either jump in or message me because, as I said, I can't see you. So most of the peeps here are young peeps, and we've got a few older peeps who would also be thinking about transitioning into different forms of organizing and careers. Now, one of the things, I guess, you and I are old heads now, but back in the day, both you and I would have this kind of exoticism, right? The young people are going to do this, right? These young organizers are the shit. They're the dope. Wow, wow, wow. And then they would co-opt, and then you would basically see most of the people burn out or then go away, right? So how do we get over the idea of romanticizing youth organizing or newer people and provide the tools that they could succeed? So that's kind of one of the first questions. How do we avoid co-optation? That's number one. Number two, in your book, you know what? And for all of us who've had fallouts, and I've had fallouts with a lot of my mentors. And and what you did in the book, which it's really surprising in many ways, but it's really mature of you, is you're really kind, you're generous, and you're caring to people who you've differed with. And that's a really mature thing to do. That I think a lot of people haven't done that, right? How do you come to that form of maturity, right? How do you basically learn from these experiences, build after a breakup or a breaking of a falling of a relationship to an organization that you've been involved with? So first question about co-op. Number two, the healing that needs to happen after the fallout or division amongst organizers. And number three, I think for me, is the role of, you were both a grassroots organizer and then you went to work for quote unquote the mainstream movement, right? How do you navigate or negotiate those different spaces? Which I think are, and just my understanding from the trajectory from all of you, if you do pursue academia, organizing, policy, or activism, these are some of the challenges that all of us are going to face, or what you're going to face. So I think those are the three questions I want to start off with. And if you haven't read the book yet, after the semester is done, after this course is done, it's one of those things that I really strongly encourage you to read. Okay, I'll shut up now, brother.
Oh, well, great questions. In terms of co-optation of young people, their visionary ideas and their organizing spaces, one of the groups that I've really seen do well in terms of a group of old heads is Indigenous Climate Action. They've really done well since they've been, Indigenous Climate Action is Canada's only national Indigenous environmental climate justice organization. They're based, they have organizers across the country, but predominantly based in the province of Alberta. And they've been organizing delegations to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for a number of years and organizing. They have a very strong youth program and generally just are really good allies to young indigenous peoples. And from what I've seen, and again, my qualifier here is just I'm an old guy and I got teenagers, but that's it. I was a youth organizer way back in the day, and I experienced the mistakes of a lot of old organizers back in the day. And I've made similar mistakes with young organizers in my career as I've aged. And I think that young people need to have a degree of space to be able to be creative, to build power, to have the presence of organizers and leaders within social movements, to be present with them and to listen to them, to give them the space not only to kick ass, but also to get their asses kicked and to make mistakes and to become more tempered, so that they don't crack under pressure. The only way to do that is through organizing on your own, and going through experiential learning processes and healing your ego and your body and your spirit and your mind, when you experience loss. And I think that um, one of the things I want to really make sure that you all understand is that I don't believe that it's up to the young people to save the world, to save us as human beings, to save themselves. I think that we all have a piece of that responsibility. And the idea of consistently having conversations in our organizing spaces about collective decision making is very, very critical. Consensus building is very, very critical. And that's why I brought up the ideas around building movement alignment. We have to have a clear understanding of our different roles. One of my good friends, Bill McKibben, one of the co-founders of 350.org, he's an old guy, and he's been organizing with a group in the United States called Third Act. And Third Act is organizing retired persons across the United States of America to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, because these people are retired. They're living on their 401(k)s or whatever those are called, and they got savings, and it's not a big issue for them to go and get arrested protesting banks financing pipelines. It's certainly not as big an issue for them as it is for a young person, especially a young person of color, to get arrested and threaten their academic career before they even get into the professional workforce, with criminal charges. And the reality of circumstances now is that, petitions ain't going to do it. We literally have to throw a wrench into the system and, stop business as usual. And that's a very privileged place, that we sit in here in North America, because, in other economies around the planet, for people even to get a news headline, they, they have to engage in militant tactics, life-threatening tactics, just to even get their issues seen in mainstream media across the planet, because of the level of militarization that they live with. We see that in Palestine. We see that in all kinds of conflicts in other economies that are not Canada. And so, I think that young people, should have a lot of autonomy, but within a structure of social movement organizing and power building that is about building movement alignment with an intergenerational framework that activates people of all ages, but that we understand our roles within that. And part of organizing is defining roles and making collective consensus agreements about the rules of engagement on any mass mobilization or civil disobedience, and practicing the discipline to stick to that. And so, yeah, in terms of my experience, having fallouts in social movements, with mentors or, with different organizations or different arms of the social movements, I've had my fair share of conflicts, and I've contributed to a lot of divisiveness, in social movements such as the environmental justice movement, power struggles, over resources in a scarce resource environment are a constant pressure for organizers and leadership within social movements to contend with. Relationship with Hollywood, with people with power, wealthy people, with foundations and funders, with government, with banks and academia. Those relationships can often be viewed as gatekeeping. But for those that have those relationships, we also understand that those relationships and the trust within them are hard fought for. And so you have to be protective of those things from, people who haven't demonstrated the wherewithal or the longevity of sticking in social movements. I've seen a lot of people come and go in the pipeline fights over the decades and the fight to stop the expansion of the tar sands. A lot of people come and shit talk, and then, my approach to that has always been to give them the power that they're seeking and to let them make the mistakes when they can't handle the pressure. And, usually they just disappear into the ether and don't come back, which sucks because you want to retain people in the movement. And I think that, after my fifth or so career burnout, when I started the process of my transmedia storytelling project, Life in the City of Dirty Water, I was exhausted, from consistently organizing from a place of hatred and anger and revenge, vengeance towards colonization, towards the violence and poverty experienced in my community, over the issue of murdered and missing women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, over the residential school stuff, like I was really fucking angry. And over time, it began to consume me from the inside out. It began to cannibalize me. And I turned to the drink. I was an alcoholic. I'm in recovery now. I'm sober now. But, at great cost, though, working from a place of hatred and vengeance to fuel my organizing and my, the power that I was using to do organizing, it was not sustainable. And I've realized at my age and as a father that the only way to win this fight is with radical honesty, rigorous authenticity, and love. Like straight up, sounds cheesy, but straight up fucking love, and truth, and so moving forward, that's where I'm working from. And I, over the last many years, like the last 5 or so years, I've had to really take a good hard look at, the people I've had conflicts with, and to forgive them, and to take responsibility for my actions towards those conflicts, and to resolve those things to the best of my ability without causing further harm to people. I just wish I had that lesson and understanding in my 20s, and that it wasn't in my 40s before I figured it out. But, that's where I have faith in young people today, that maybe they'll figure that shit out in the 30s, and then the next generation in the 20s, and the next generation in their when they're teenagers. Who knows? Maybe there's teenagers right now who got that shit figured out. But that's all part and parcel of the sustainability of struggle, of fighting against oppression. I really believe that love and forgiveness and are really key elements. And just because I love unconditionally and I forgive people does not mean that I don't want justice.
Thank you, brother. Questions from the audience? And remember, if you're on Zoom, I can't see you, so either talk up or send me a message. Question? You gotta introduce your name too. Oh, come on up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I could hear you.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Anais. Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I just have a quick question regarding sort of the overarching theme that I didn't really fully go from just some excerpts. The overarching theme of healing and that connectedness to the mind. I want you to talk about what, first of all, in your life, the role of spirituality and healing has been in and also the role that young people can, let me rephrase this. It's in a way like that the role of spirituality and healing and connectedness to the land. How can we center that at the heart of climate change initiatives as and kind of like how can we promote that understanding?
All right, you got all that?
Yeah, I
Right.
think I got it. There is an incredible sickness that human beings, I think we've had it for a really long time. I think that it's rooted in some of the great empires like imperialism, and 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 I think that like patriarchy plays a big part of it, but it's the sickness of greed. Um, and there's this gaping emptiness inside of a lot of human beings today, and that emptiness was created by and exacerbated by industrialization and a deep wound to our spiritual umbilical cord, to the biosphere, the sacred nature of the place of where Creator put us, or whatever your belief is, where you evolved, and where you migrated. I don't know what your beliefs are, but the connection to nature is a critical element in our mental well-being, in our spiritual well-being, in our emotional balance. And the only cure to the sickness of greed that is so pervasive across all economies on Mother Earth, is a connection to nature. And human beings right now are going through a huge process, whether you're conscious of it or not, of reevaluating our relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth. And indigenous peoples, our relationship is still very fresh. We haven't had that relationship severed by hundreds or thousands of years of imperialism and industrialization and whatnot. We're still very much connected to the sacredness of Mother Earth. And we also understand the end of the world and organizing and building power within that context. And so I think that, moving forward, Indigenous peoples play a vital and critical role, because, we have so much authority when it comes to stopping the expansion of unsustainable infrastructure, such as the fossil fuel extractivism that's happening across the planet, because the only places where fossil fuel is still concentrated is in our homelands, which is ironic because we were pushed into the shittiest places, when colonization was happening, but it ended up being the places where the most resources, as far as energy, exist. But these are also the places where the highest concentration of renewable energy exists. And so if we don't fix these systems of oppression, listen to the traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples, and reconnect in our own way to the sacredness of the place where we live, we will continue to be possessed by the spirit of greed and unhappiness and hyper individualism, instead of surrendering to the peace and serenity of being a part of the collective, and stepping into that role as a land defender and water protector, and taking care of not just our own well-being, but the well-being of those that cannot speak for themselves, that share this biosphere with us. And I'm talking, of course, about our plant and animal relatives.
Thanks to both of you. Anybody else? Questions, comments, anybody?
We got someone from Miles Absi raised his hand.
All right, Miles, go for it.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for talking with us, first of all. My question kind of comes from a place more so about like actual social implications as like identifying and being an Indigenous person in Canada. How do you like navigate conversations where people either, I guess, treat you differently because of your identity, or for example, like with white apologists, like how do you handle those types of interactions? Because it seems to be a very like tricky field to navigate.
Can I just add to that? Let's go beyond tokenism, right? So how do we actually challenge tokenism?
White tears, white tears. Oh God, white tears. White liberal guilt is probably one of the most toxic fucking things to deal with if you're a brown or black person. Y'all feel me? Brown, black people in the room?
Yeah.
Especially the tears of white women. You know, as a big brown Indian man, you know, I don't know how many times, you know, liberal feminism and just old white men, you know, and white tears have been used to shut me down or attempt to shut me down when I'm outing or calling in people who are acting irrationally or racist or bigoted. And you know, and the whole angry brown man trope, you know, I don't know how many times that's been used to attempt to shut me down individually. And it's very toxic, you know. It's very, very toxic, you know, and I've experienced, you know, and I know that my black brothers and sisters and the Black Lives Matter movement have experienced that. I know that my Palestinian and, you know, Islamic relatives, you know, have experienced that when confronting Zionism. You know, the list goes on and on and on. And, you know, for me, when we talk about social movement change theory, I don't prescribe to some of the historical models. You know, I'm a base builder. I believe that my liberation is tied to other people, other communities in struggle who are experiencing the same or similar struggles to mine. I believe that our liberation is tied together, and you know, that's where I expend a lot of my energy. Is not in confronting, you know, people who are comfortable in this economy. You know, they're very hard to change. You know, the people who, you know, when you ask people who are property owners and they have a couple cash properties and, you know, own a couple cars and they got savings, you know, generational wealth. They haven't had the systemic barriers to accumulating wealth, you know, that tends to come with stolen Indian land and stolen labor of black and brown people. You know, like those people are really hard to change, you know, because when you ask them to change, they think that you're asking them to make their children uncomfortable. But most of those people are card carrying, not the really rich ones, but the middle class ones are tax paying, law abiding citizens. And if we change the laws and dismantle the systems that they benefit from, begrudgingly, maybe they will follow, you know. And the people that are the real evil ones, the ones that are responsible for the climate crisis and for neo-colonialism, for white supremacy, you know, these assholes, they're quite an elite group, and there's not that very many of them. They're, you know, and they have addresses. We know where they live, we know where they work, we know where they holiday, and we know when they get together to plan further oppression and profit. And we can get them. So
Thanks to both of you again. Any other questions?
I have one. if that's
Sure.
okay.
Hey, Tegan.
Hi, Clayton. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I wanted to ask about how do you define and create space for your cause, even when there's so many things going on in the world that feel like they need your attention? And how do you create solidarity between your individual cause to the solidarity required for these other conflicts or violences that are happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. In many ways, you answered it. You know, this is what my shirt says. Is solidarity. Um, it, you know, a lot of people when I talk about movement amnesia, it was the international solidarity movement that built the global power for the big fucking showdown in 1999 in Seattle, Battle of Seattle, when the WTO was going to consolidate, neoliberalism, and free trade, secret global tribunals, like all of that crazy shit. They were gonna like become the new world order, and through international solidarity and the coming together of such incredibly diverse social movements, we were able to stop them. And we forced economies like the United States and Canada to go into a decades long process of negotiating bilateral free trade agreements, which we could then organize, that provided trajectories of organizing to combat against neoliberalism, hyper predatory capitalism. Um, and by no means is that story over. And it's consistently morphing and changing. And the military industrial complex is a big part of that now. We see that in Ukraine and in Palestine, in the $105 billion tax aid package that President Biden has just asked Congress for, to fuel both. That's being driven by corporations that manufacture warheads and all of the expensive equipment required for these types of conflicts. It's huge profit. It's profiteers. It's capitalism. It's free trade. Um, and even the Paris Climate Accord. This is a free trade agreement. This is an agreement to commodify the last remaining element of our biosphere, the Earth's atmospheric carbon cycling capacity, to turn it into nothing more than a a dump for the global elite, for oil corporations, for the military, for G8 economies to have a financial mechanism to basically fraudulently expand their fossil fuel regime while the rest of the world doesn't, through schemes like carbon trading and forest offsets, and monocrop, culture, replacing critical biospheres like the boreal forest here in Canada and around the world's circumpolar regions, and in places like the Amazon rainforest and the Congo. Canada can plant, a 1,000 acres of monocropped palm oil trees, burn down the indigenous villages in those areas and plant these monocrops, and then pay, those native people to manage to clean the shit out of the outhouses on those monocrop plantations, and call it climate, climate change. This is fucking crazy stuff that's happening right now. And so, solidarity is the key. We must show up for each other without strings attached. Like, I don't show up at the ceasefire now protest, telling people there that they got to show up at the stop Coastal GasLink from invading Wet'suwet'en territory. No, I show up there and I fight hard for my brothers and sisters with the knowledge that they will reciprocate, and they do. And I think that that's right across social movements. Solidarity, solidarity, solidarity.
Right, I think we've got time maybe for one last question. Anybody?
I have a question.
Yeah, Elijah.
Yeah, I guess my question, kind of spoke about this a little bit about burnout. Is kind of like figuring out how to navigate yourself in a place where we have social media, and so we get so much content so often. Like I used to watch CNN with my dad quite often. I had to stop because it was just I affect my mental health negatively. I want to ask you, how do you keep persisting through when you see consistent problems going on? You know, I know that's our job to keep fighting, but sometimes it feels like you're fighting something, you're pushing a rock up a hill, and you know eventually it'll come back down. So, how do you navigate that, or feel like you are making a progressive difference? Doesn't mean it's big or being seen, but you know you're making an impact. How do you keep pushing forward amongst that?
Yeah, we talked about it, I think, a little bit in the question around the role of spirituality. Um, not everybody's spiritual, not everybody's prayerful, in the recovery community, I mentioned that I'm a recovering alcoholic. Um, we the whole idea about recovering from alcoholism is finding a higher power and surrendering to it. And that at the beginning that might start with, just connecting with nature. It might be looking at your, the sacred creation of your baby. Maybe you're a new father, you're a new mother, and but as you go on and as you learn different practices such as meditation, mindfulness, um, and as you open yourself to experiencing miracles, because they do happen every day. Um, the pathway leads you to a place where you can actually, maybe, we won't call it pray, but where you can ask the universe for help. And that's a really sacred and personal journey of every person that's getting politicized and involved in social movements, and just in your own development as a human being. um but there are other people on that journey, and you can have those conversations and ask other people what they're experiencing, or how they're dealing with burnout, how they're dealing with the toxicity of social media and the corporate media. um I will say this, the answer to war and conflict and the existential threat of climate change and racism, is not big international compacts like the Paris Climate Accord or whatever. The answer to all of these problems is this concept called community self-determination. And organizing is viewed as such a dangerous thing to those in power, because when we build power in the community to self-determine over our access to clean water, our access to food security, our access to education, and our control over education, transportation, our ability to live, work, play, and pray in a safe and healthy environment, this is huge, and the more this happens, rinse and repeat across Mother Earth on a local level, we will see, these catastrophic global issues diminish. But this is an intergenerational project, and many of us alive today will not see the fruits of our organizing effort, but our children will, and their children will. And um, hyper individualism and capitalism has tried to diminish how beautiful and sacred we are, and has tried to diminish our ability to see into the future and to remember our past and to experience the present to its fullest. Now, a lot of people who say that the Cree are real special because we think 7 generations ahead, but that's not actually accurate. We do think in 7 generations, but it's not 7 generations ahead. When we plan, we consider the teachings and the sacrifice and the experience of the 3 generations previous to us. We consider the here and now, where we're at in time, the present, and we consider the implications of our actions on the next 3 generations. All of that in a singular moment in the revolution of time. And that is a teaching that Indigenous peoples can bring to the rest of human beings here on Mother Earth, as we spiral around the sun. Anyway, that's all the time I got with y'all. I hope this was
Thank you so
helpful.
much. I just want to close off. So I am a member of the faculty club across a place there, all the hoity-toity people. So I kind of invite myself in there, I chomp on my burgers, I like hang up on myself. And so why don't I tell you this little story? Because it's really interesting, brother. So the people who go there definitely don't line up with my classmates. They're anything but who I am. And I just go, I do my thing. It's actually not as expensive to eat if you're a member than anywhere else. So I go there and it's quicker sometimes. And the other people who are part of this so-called community across the street are crisis management consultants who are advertising their thing. I was going to bring I'll bring it next week, their little cards. And these crisis management, so this thing, if you've got a crisis, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous grievance, police brutality, they've got some peeps there for you that meets, talk, charge you lots of money to deal with people like yourself and many of you in the room. All right, so while all of us are talking here, people across the street are meeting, exchanging lots of money to try to suppress people like Clayton. So, this is not just kind of an academic exercise, right? People's communities are under attack for the important work that you and many of your colleagues are doing. And I think for you to spend the time with us today, thank you so much. It's important lessons. I'm going to share this with just the class. I'm not going to share it outside. And hopefully we'll have some time next semester to link up again. And let us know when you're going to be here for your book launch.
Yeah.
And then, I'll try to get us, if it's during the class time, we can go to the class together.
Awesome. Well, thank
All
you
right.
so much, everybody.
Love.
We'll see you out in the streets and out on the land.
Thank you so much. Bye, Clayton.
See ya.